The air was crisp that night, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth, but Elior hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on the moon, which hung impossibly low in the sky, luminous and expectant. The silver thread pulsed between them, brighter than ever, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. He climbed higher on the rooftop than ever before, hands gripping the edges of the warm clay tiles. Below, the village slept quietly, oblivious to the strange, tense magic unfolding above. The girl watched from her usual spot in the shadows, her notebook clutched to her chest, eyes wide with anticipation. She did not speak, but her presence gave him courage. Elior raised both hands, trembling, and reached upward, willing himself to touch the moon. The thread of silver stretched taut, quivering like a living thing, and for a heartbeat he thought it might snap. But then it pulsed with warmth, wrapping around his fingertips like molten light. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever felt, weightless yet powerful, soft yet pressing with the gravity of eternity. His heart raced. I can feel you, he whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. I can hold you. The moon responded, not with sound, but with a shimmer so bright it bathed the entire rooftop in silver. Shadows melted and reformed around him, folding and bending in impossible ways, and the stars seemed to lean closer, watching. Elior realized that this was no longer a mere game of curiosity. He was stepping into something ancient, something that had waited centuries for a human heart brave, or foolish, enough to reach. The girl stepped closer, lifting her hand tentatively. The thread pulsed toward her as well, splitting softly, weaving a delicate web of silver between 3 points, boy, girl, and moon. Elior gasped as he felt the moonlight flow through him, into her, and back again, a circular pulse of energy, warm and alive, almost like breathing. For the first time, Elior understood the true meaning of borrowing the moon. It was not possession, it was connection, it was trust, and it demanded care, patience, and courage in equal measure. The thread shimmered one last time, sending ripples of light across the rooftops. Then it held steady, quivering like a heartbeat between them. Elior felt a sense of exhilaration and fear. He had reached for the impossible, and the impossible had responded. Above, the moon hung patiently, luminous and immense. And somewhere deep in the pulse of silver, Elior felt a quiet, thrilling certainty. The night had opened itself to him, and he was no longer merely a boy watching the sky. He had become part of it. The silver thread lingered between Elior's fingertips long after the moon had settled into its nightly orbit. For the first time, he could feel its substance, not weight, exactly, but a tangible warmth that filled his palms like liquid light. It was delicate yet insistent, almost as if it were testing him, asking, "Do you understand what you hold?" The girl crouched nearby, watching him with wide, reverent eyes. It looks alive," she whispered. "Like it's breathing with you." Elior nodded, though he was still in awe. "I've never felt anything like this." He let the silver thread flow across both hands, letting it drape over his arms, following the contours of his body. It hummed gently, a vibration that resonated through his chest, through his bones, and even into his thoughts. He realized that holding the moonlight was not just an act of wonder, it was an act of responsibility. He experimented carefully, tugging gently at the thread. The moonlight expanded outward, stretching across rooftops, cascading in ripples that painted the village below in pale silver. Shadows danced unnaturally along walls and alleyways, bending and folding like living things. The girl gasped, scribbling in her notebook, capturing shapes that defied ordinary logic. "It's changing the world," she murmured. "Even a little bit." Elior's pulse quickened. Each movement of the silver thread created subtle shifts in the environment. Clouds slowed their drift across the sky, leaves hovered briefly before settling, and even the river reflected strange, elongated patterns of light. Holding the moonlight was no longer a personal act, it had consequences. He paused, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing gently on his mind. If I am careless, if I let this spill too far, what will happen? The moon pulsed in response, bright and patient. Elior sensed reassurance in the rhythm of the light. It trusted him, but it demanded care. He closed his eyes and let the silver thread flow naturally, letting it coil and pulse like a heartbeat, learning its rhythm. Hours passed, though time seemed irrelevant. When he finally lowered his hands, the silver thread lingered faintly, like a memory, shimmering on the tiles. The village below remained asleep, untouched by fear, yet subtly altered by the borrowed light. Elior realized something profound. The moon was not just a light to admire, it was a force to respect. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to hold a piece of eternity in his hands. Above, the moon glowed faintly, as if smiling at him. And Elior knew that tomorrow, and every night after, his life, and the world around him, would be quietly, irreversibly changed. The next morning, Elior awoke with a peculiar heaviness in his chest, as though the silver thread he had held so tenderly the night before had left an imprint on him. The village below looked ordinary at first glance. The narrow alleys were still lined with clay rooftops, merchants opened their stalls, and the distant river glimmered faintly in the early sun. Yet something felt off. As he stepped outside, he noticed it. The subtle glow that usually lingered on the edges of the night had vanished. Shadows were sharper, harsher, less forgiving. Even the stars in the receding dawn seemed dimmer, almost ashamed. The world, without the moonlight he had borrowed, felt incomplete, thinner somehow, as if the sky itself were missing a heartbeat. Elior's heart sank. He had imagined that holding a fragment of the moon's light was purely wondrous, a magical secret between him and the night. But now he realized that every pull of that silver thread had consequences. The moonlight he had carried had left behind a hollow, a faint emptiness in the world it once touched. He ran to the river, where he often went to watch the reflection of the moon. Normally, the surface mirrored the sky perfectly, capturing every star, every wisp of cloud, every silver detail of the moon. Today, the reflection seemed muted, distorted, almost flat. Even the water seemed to sense the absence, rippling with a subtle discontent. The girl appeared silently, her notebook clutched to her chest. She had noticed too. Elior, look. She pointed toward the shadows of the nearby trees, where familiar shapes twisted unnaturally. It's like the world is trying to adjust without it. Elior knelt beside her, touching the grass, feeling its dampness. He could almost sense the threads of reality fraying where the moonlight had been absent. The warmth and pulse he had felt were gone, leaving only faint echoes. It was beautiful, still, but incomplete, fragile, vulnerable. He swallowed hard. I didn't realize. His voice trembled. I thought borrowing a little light would be harmless. The girl shook her head, eyes wide. Magic like that, it doesn't work in small doses. Even a whisper of it can stretch across the village. Elior's thoughts turned to the elders' warnings, their cryptic words echoing in his mind. The moon pulls at the soul. It makes you want things that do not belong to you. He understood now that their caution had been about more than superstition. To borrow the moon's light, even a fragment, was to alter the balance of the world itself. He returned to the rooftop that evening, the sky growing dark around him. The moon hung heavy and luminous, as if aware of his guilt, of the emptiness left behind. Elior reached out, letting the silver thread flow again, this time with care, patience, and reverence. He realized the act of holding Moonlight was no longer about wonder, it was about responsibility, about repairing what had been unintentionally disturbed. The thread pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat syncing with his own, stretching outward toward the village below. Shadows softened, the river shimmered faintly, and the air seemed to hold its breath. The world was healing, but fragile, delicate, and deeply aware of the gift it had been lent. Elior understood then that borrowing the moon was not just a privilege. It was a covenant. Every night, every thread of silver, every pulse of light carried with it the weight of the world. He had touched eternity, and now he had to nurture it. The girl stepped beside him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "We'll learn," she said quietly. "Together." Elior nodded. In that moment, they both understood that magic, once borrowed, could not be returned without care, and that the night, patient and immense, had begun to teach them lessons they had not imagined. The days that followed were quiet at first, almost deceptive in their calm. But by the third night, Elior began to notice strange shifts in the world around him. The river, once obedient to the pull of the tides, seemed restless, sluggish in some places, racing in others, as if it had forgotten the rhythm it had followed for centuries. Reflections of the moonlight flickered irregularly on its surface, bending and fracturing as though unsure where to settle. He stood on the familiar rooftop, the girl beside him, eyes tracing the river's erratic shimmer. "It's not right," she whispered. "The water, it's like it's confused." Elior's hands trembled as he held the silver thread again. The moon hung low and immense, its glow softer tonight, yet pulsing with quiet urgency. Every pulse of light he had borrowed seemed to ripple across the village, tugging at the fabric of the natural world. Even the wind carried an unnatural rhythm, pausing midair and swirling without warning. The rooftops of the village cast odd, shifting shadows, as if the moonlight itself were bending reality. Elior realized with a shiver that the world had not merely been altered, it had begun to adapt to the borrowed glow, reshaping itself around him. Every pull, every pulse, every touch of light created consequences he could feel but not yet control. "I didn't think," Elior began, voice trembling, "that taking even a little would change things like this." The girl reached for his hand. "Magic isn't simple. It doesn't obey wishes. It listens, but it also acts." He swallowed, the weight of the realization pressing against his chest. Even the animals seemed unsettled. Dogs wandered through empty streets, ears pricked to invisible sounds. Cats crouched and darted as though seeing something beyond sight. Birds flew erratically, their wings catching stray threads of moonlight as they passed. Elior lifted his hands higher, letting the silver thread coil gently, seeking balance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the river calmed, the wind steadied, the shadows softened. He could feel the pulse of the night, synchronized with the rhythm of the moon itself. Holding the moonlight was no longer an experiment, it was a responsibility. The girl leaned closer, her notebook abandoned on the tiles. "Do you think it's asking something of us?" Elior nodded. "Yes. Patience, care, and trust." He looked up at the luminous orb above. "We have to learn how to guide it without breaking it." For the first time, he felt the magnitude of what he had borrowed. The silver thread in his hands was not a toy. It was a living piece of the night, stretching between earth and sky, reshaping tides, shadows, and hearts alike. And somewhere deep within, Elior understood that the night itself had begun to teach him the cost of reaching too far, and the reward of doing so carefully. The moon pulsed gently, almost approvingly, while the girl squeezed his hand. Together, they watched the river, the rooftops, the village, a world slowly remembering its rhythm, guided by a boy who dared to hold a fragment of eternity. It began as an idea, small and fragile, whispered between Elior and the girl under the silver light. What if they could hold a piece of the moon not just in imagination, but physically? Not all at once, of course, the moon was too immense, too ancient, but a fragment, captured delicately, like water in a crystal jar. They returned to the rooftop after the village had fallen asleep, carrying a simple glass jar Elior had found in his father's kitchen. Its surface was smooth, cool, and empty, waiting for something it had never known. The moon hung low, luminous and almost patient, as if it understood the audacity of their plan. "Are you sure?" the girl whispered. "Even a little, it might change everything." Elior finished her sentence, nodding. "I know. But I have to try." He reached out, and the silver thread responded immediately, flowing across his hands, coiling gently into the jar. The light shimmered, stretching and contracting like liquid silver. For a heartbeat, the jar seemed to float in his hands, glowing softly, humming with an energy that was neither entirely light nor entirely warmth, it was both, and more. The girl's eyes widened. "It's alive," she breathed, her hands hovering over the jar, afraid to touch, yet drawn irresistibly to the glow. Elior nodded, feeling the pulse of the moonlight through his fingers, the rhythm of the thread syncing with his own heartbeat. He realized that what they were holding was not just light, it was attention, consciousness, a fragment of the moon's quiet sentience. The jar vibrated gently, as though acknowledging him, thanking him, testing him. Outside, the village slept, oblivious. But shadows had begun to act strangely again. A stray cat paused mid-step, arching its back to the invisible pulse of silver. The river shimmered with fragments of reflected light, ripples forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate. The borrowed moonlight had presence, and now, confined in the jar, it felt alive in ways they could sense but not control. Elior looked at the girl. "We have to be careful. It's more than light. He trailed off, unable to find words. "It's something that listens. Something that learns." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the glow. "And it knows we're holding it." They sat together, hands hovering near the jar, letting the silver pulse flow gently between them. Time seemed suspended, the world outside reduced to quiet, expectant shadows. Every heartbeat, every thought, every subtle movement rippled through the jar, and Elior understood for the first time the true weight of their experiment. Borrowing the moonlight had been a step. Holding it, even in a fragment, was a covenant. They had not captured the moon, it had allowed itself to be shared. And with that sharing came responsibility beyond their understanding, a promise that the night itself would now test them. The jar pulsed gently in Elior's hands, a miniature heartbeat of the cosmos. And he knew, deep down, that once you hold a piece of eternity, the world itself begins to bend toward your choices. That night, after placing the jar carefully on the rooftop between them, Elior and the girl lay side by side, staring up at the moon. But sleep came differently now. Each time Elior closed his eyes, visions stirred behind his lids, silver threads twisting through impossible skies, stars bending toward unknown horizons, and glimpses of places he had never seen yet somehow felt familiar. The girl shivered beside him. "I think it's giving us dreams," she whispered. "Like showing us things." Elior nodded, eyes wide in wonder. In his mind, the silver light wove elaborate patterns, forming pathways of glowing arcs that stretched from rooftops to clouds to distant mountains. Each pulse of the jar seemed to carry a thought, a memory, a whisper of the moon's own long existence. He saw oceans that glimmered with light instead of water, forests where trees grew in spirals toward invisible suns, and cities floating in the night sky, luminous and alive. "It feels real," he murmured. "Like the moon is remembering through us." The girl reached for his hand, and when their fingers touched, the silver glow in the jar seemed to ripple, spreading warmth through their hearts. The dreams intensified, merging, forming a network of visions that connected boy, girl, and the fragment of moonlight they had captured. Every pulse felt sentient, responsive, as though the moon itself were guiding them, offering lessons hidden in imagery and emotion. Yet beneath the beauty, there was a subtle disquiet. Some visions were darker, shadows stretching without source, stars extinguishing one by one, forests bending in impossible ways. Elior realized that holding Moonlight was not merely a gift, it was a responsibility that tested the heart. For every wonder it offered, it revealed the fragility of the world it touched. Hours, or perhaps minutes, for time felt stretched, past. They awoke together at dawn, still holding hands, the jar glowing faintly like a pulse beneath the silver light of the returning sun. The visions lingered in their minds, shaping thoughts, filling them with awe and unease. "We're part of something bigger," Elior said softly. "Something alive, and it's teaching us, but also testing us." The girl nodded, brushing her hair from her face. "We have to be careful. If it's showing us these things, imagine what it could do if we're reckless." Elior looked at the jar, its silver glow subdued in daylight, and felt a profound mixture of reverence and fear. They had borrowed a fragment of eternity, and in return, eternity had begun to teach through dreams, guiding them toward wisdom, but also revealing the consequences of even the smallest misstep. Above, the moon watched silently, luminous and patient. The night had begun to whisper its secrets to two young hearts. And they would never sleep the same way again. The morning after their shared dreams, Elior noticed subtle shifts in the village. It started with small things, an unfamiliar glimmer on the river's surface, tiles on rooftops catching the sunlight differently, shadows folding in ways that felt intentional. He paused mid-step, noticing a crow that hovered a moment longer than usual before taking flight, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the narrow street. The girl was waiting on the rooftop when he returned. "You saw it too," she said quietly, eyes scanning the village below. "Things aren't the same, and it's only been a night." Elior nodded, feeling a pull in his chest. The silver jar sat between them, humming faintly, a quiet heartbeat that seemed aware of their conversation. Each pulse sent subtle ripples through the air, touching rooftops, twisting shadows, bending the light just enough that the village seemed awake, though no one else had noticed yet. "Maybe it's the moon," Elior murmured. "Even a fragment of it changes everything it touches." The girl shivered. "It's alive," she whispered, almost in awe. "And it's not just us. It's affecting the world too." They experimented cautiously, letting their hands hover near the jar. When Elior lifted the silver thread slightly, leaves trembled along the alleys, and a stray cat paused mid-step, watching something invisible. When the girl let the thread graze her fingers, the river shimmered in concentric rings, reflecting impossible stars even under daylight. Elior realized something alarming. The moonlight they held was not static. It had agency, awareness, and reach. Even in fragments, it could ripple outward, altering the physical world and bending reality subtly toward its presence. "Do you think the villagers will notice?" he asked, a thread of worry in his voice. The girl shook her head. "Not yet, but if we're not careful, it might become impossible to hide." A soft pulse emanated from the jar, almost like a gentle warning. Shadows lengthened and curled along the rooftops as if observing them, responding to the rhythm of the silver thread. The moonlight had begun to weave itself into the fabric of their village, binding boy, girl, and town together in a delicate, magical tension. Elior clenched his fists around the thread. He felt exhilaration, but also a creeping fear. To hold a piece of eternity was to shake the world in ways he could not fully control. Yet the wonder, the thrill of connection, was irresistible. Together, they watched the village beneath them, aware that their secret was no longer confined to the rooftop. Every heartbeat, every gesture, every pulse of silver light was now a thread in the tapestry of reality itself. The night had begun to stretch its influence through the day, and Elior knew that once the moonlight touched the world, nothing could remain the same. The next evening, Elior and the girl returned to the rooftop, the jar of moonlight cradled carefully between them. The village below was quiet, yet a sense of tension lingered, subtle but undeniable. Shadows had begun to act oddly, stretching along walls and streets without clear source, flickering as if aware of something unseen. "It's noticing us," the girl whispered, her eyes fixed on the silver glow. "The moonlight, it's aware." Elior nodded, feeling a shiver run down his spine. He had sensed the moon's awareness before, in dreams and pulses of light, but now the awareness seemed to extend outward, creeping into the village itself. The stray cat that often roamed the alleys paused mid-step, ears twitching as if listening to a conversation it could not hear. A soft breeze rustled, carrying faint murmurs that seemed more than ordinary wind. The jar pulsed once, twice, then stretched a thin, delicate thread of light outward, brushing against the edges of nearby rooftops. Shadows recoiled and twisted around it, bending unnaturally, forming shapes that resembled figures in quiet motion. Elior realized, with a pang of awe and fear, that the moonlight was interacting with the very essence of the village, testing boundaries, shaping perception. "Do you think it wants something?" he asked. The girl shook her head slowly. "It's not about want or need. It's intelligence. Like it's learning." Elior's pulse quickened. He had thought that holding the moonlight was a secret act of wonder, an intimate communion. But now it was more. The silver thread had begun to weave itself into reality, leaving subtle marks on streets, rooftops, even the air itself. The village was no longer ordinary. It had become a living canvas for something larger, older, and infinitely patient. A sudden ripple of light flowed through the jar, coiling around Elior's hands like liquid silver. He felt it respond to his heartbeat, his breath, his very thoughts. Every movement, even the smallest, echoed outward, tugging at shadows, stirring the wind, bending the river's reflection. The jar was alive, and the village had become part of its consciousness. "We have to be careful," Elior said, voice tense. "It's teaching us, but we might not understand the lessons yet." The girl nodded, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "We've borrowed more than we thought. And it's whispering through everything." Above, the full moon hung luminous and patient. Its light touched every corner of the village in ways the villagers would never perceive. But Elior knew, they were no longer observers. They were participants. And in the shadows, the moonlight stirred, weaving its lessons, its presence, and its quiet, sentient pulse into the world itself. The night had fallen like a heavy curtain over the village, deeper than usual, thick with anticipation and quiet energy. Elior and the girl climbed to the rooftop, the jar of moonlight carefully cradled between them. In its delicate glow, every tile, every ridge of the rooftops seemed to shimmer faintly, as if the village itself were breathing beneath the silver light. Elior paused, feeling a weight in his chest that was neither fear nor awe. It was something deeper, something that vibrated with the rhythm of the world itself. "I can feel it moving," he whispered. "Not just here, not just with us, everywhere." The girl's eyes widened. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the jar. "It's like the village is listening," she said. "Even the air feels aware." They stayed in silence for a long moment, letting the silver thread pulse gently through their hands. The jar shimmered, responding to their quiet attention, stretching delicate tendrils of light that hovered above rooftops, arched along the alleys, and even reached the river in faint glimmers. Elior noticed the water reflecting the light in patterns that shifted subtly with every pulse, almost as though it were reading the movements of the silver energy. Below, the village was asleep, or at least, it seemed so. Yet Elior sensed an unusual stillness, a tension under the ordinary calm. The shadows had begun to move independently, coiling along walls and across cobblestones, forming shapes that were almost human, yet not entirely. He drew a slow breath. "This is more than we expected," he murmured. I thought the moonlight would just be light. But it's alive." The girl nodded, her own hands hovering above the jar without touching it. "It's learning from us, and it's learning about the village. Everything we've borrowed, it ripples out." Elior shivered, realizing the magnitude of what they were doing. Each pulse of moonlight was more than a glow, it was attention, presence, awareness. The silver thread between the jar and the sky hummed gently, as though the moon itself were observing, patient and luminous, but not without intent. And then he noticed the first subtle effects on the villagers. A dog in a distant alley stopped mid-step, its ears pricked, as if listening to something invisible. Its shadow stretched impossibly long across the cobblestones, coiling in shapes that almost resembled the village itself, a miniature map of houses and streets, glowing faintly in silver outlines. Elior's heart raced. The moonlight was interacting not just with him and the girl, it was reaching into life itself. A soft ripple of light flowed across the rooftops and touched the window of the bakery. Inside, a young boy stirred in his sleep. His dreams were heavier than usual, filled with fleeting visions of silver threads, shining rivers, and impossible night skies. He murmured, unconsciously following the movements of the light, and Elior realized with a pang that the moonlight could touch not only the world, but minds. The girl glanced nervously at him. "Do you think it's safe?" Elior shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I think it's trying to teach us. But it's testing boundaries too." The jar pulsed, as if affirming his thought. Elior let a thread of light extend toward the rooftops, and he felt it respond to his heartbeat, his breath, even the rhythm of his thoughts. The pulse reached the village in faint ripples. Shadows shifted again, forming almost scripted patterns across walls and streets, abstract but purposeful, like a language just out of reach. Elior realized that the moonlight was no longer just a borrowed fragment, it had begun to interact with the village itself, bending reality in subtle but undeniable ways. The wind whispered through the alleys, carrying sounds too faint to be words but too precise to be random. Leaves trembled without a breeze. The river, flowing steadily since morning, hesitated at small bends, reflecting the sky in fractured patterns, as if the water itself were aware of the silver pulse threading through the village. The girl's voice trembled. "Elior, it's changing everything." He reached for her hand, feeling the pulse of moonlight travel between them. "Yes. But it's not chaos, not yet. It's learning, like we are." Hours passed. Elior and the girl remained on the rooftop, quietly observing, experimenting, and communicating with the jar. They lifted the silver thread slightly, too high, and a flock of birds suddenly shifted in midair, coiling in arcs they had never flown before. Too low, and shadows in the alleyways grew long, stretching unnaturally, bending around corners that should have been sharp and straight. Each adjustment carried consequence. Each movement was a lesson. Elior realized, with both awe and fear, that the jar was not passive. It had intention, sentience, and patience. It responded to them, learned from them, and gently corrected them when their curiosity risked upsetting the balance. They experimented cautiously, letting small threads of light reach toward individual houses. In one home, an elderly woman slept soundly, yet her dreams reflected the silver pulse, visions of the night sky opening like a map, stars arranging themselves into impossible constellations. In another, a child dreamed of soaring through silver rivers above rooftops. The moonlight touched each life differently, subtly, with deliberate gentleness. Elior and the girl felt both exhilaration and responsibility. They had begun as observers, as small children fascinated with a distant light. But now, holding even a fragment of the moon, they were participants in the shaping of reality itself. The night deepened, and with it, their understanding. The silver thread was not just magic, it was a teacher. It offered wonder, beauty, and insight, but it demanded patience, restraint, and reverence. Every ripple that reached the village carried a lesson in balance. A sudden pulse of energy emanated from the jar, stronger than before. The shadows on the rooftops twisted in new ways, coiling like delicate fingers reaching toward the moon. The girl gasped, feeling a thrill of fear and awe. Elior's pulse synchronized with the jar, their hearts and hands tethered to the rhythm of the silver light. Elior, it's alive in ways we can barely understand, she whispered. He nodded, swallowing hard. And it's aware of the village. Of everyone in it. We're not just holding it. We're guiding it. Outside, the village slept, unaware. Yet every corner, every alley, every street was subtly touched by the pulse of the moonlight, bending reality in a quiet, imperceptible dance. The trees swayed slightly even without wind. The river shimmered in silver arcs, reflecting impossible constellations. The cats and dogs moved with a new awareness, pausing as if perceiving the subtle logic of an unseen world. Hours merged into a timeless expanse. Elior and the girl experimented with lifting the thread higher and lower, each movement carefully measured. A small arch of light above a garden caused flowers to glow faintly, petals curling toward the thread. A stream of silver brushed across the river, and tiny ripples formed delicate spirals that seemed to trace a pattern across the water's surface. Elior realized that the moonlight was teaching them through consequences. Every action, no matter how small, had an effect. They were learning patience, carefulness, and awareness of unseen connections. And the village, though unaware, was already changing, subtly, imperceptibly, under their guidance. By dawn, Elior and the girl were exhausted but exhilarated. The jar pulsed softly, almost like a satisfied sigh. Shadows had returned to normal, the river flowed steadily, and the village seemed ordinary once again, but the night had left a mark. Something intangible had shifted, a delicate weave of awareness connecting moon, boy, girl, and village. Elior held the jar close. We've only begun, he murmured. And the night, the moon, it's teaching us more than I ever imagined. The girl smiled faintly, her eyes still reflecting the silver glow. And it will keep teaching us, as long as we're careful and patient. The moon hung above, luminous, immense, and patient. Its pulse intertwined with theirs, a living heartbeat stretching across rooftops, rivers, and streets. And Elior understood, with a mix of awe, fear, and exhilaration, that borrowing the moon was no longer a secret act of wonder, it was a covenant with reality itself, one that demanded respect, courage, and an open heart. Night fell slowly over the village, thicker and more deliberate than ever. The rooftops glowed faintly in the residual light of the moon, and the wind carried a whispering stillness, as if holding its breath. Elior and the girl climbed the familiar rooftop, the jar of moonlight cradled carefully between them. Its silver pulse was steady tonight, almost expectant, as if aware that something was about to begin. Elior paused at the edge, gazing out at the village. Each street, each alley, each rooftop seemed to shimmer slightly in anticipation. Even in the absence of conscious awareness, the village had begun to resonate with the borrowed moonlight. Shadows stretched and twisted along walls, faintly bending toward the jar as though drawn to the pulse within. "It feels different tonight," the girl whispered, brushing a stray strand of hair from her eyes. "Like it wants something more." Elior nodded, his fingers tightening around the jar. He felt the pulse of the silver thread deep within his palms, a warmth that ran like liquid through his veins. Every heartbeat seemed synchronized with it, every breath measured in the rhythm of the moon. The jar was no longer just a vessel, it was alive, responsive, and patient, guiding them gently yet insistently. They watched as the first ripple of light extended outward, brushing along rooftops and across narrow alleys. A dog paused mid-step, ears pricked, its shadow bending unnaturally long across the cobblestones. A cat crouched in a garden, tail curling as the pulse brushed against it, and the flowers there shivered in response, petals unfolding toward the silver glow. "It's aware," Elior murmured. "Of us, of the village, of everything it touches." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with awe. "And it's teaching us, again. Every pulse, every movement, it's showing us the balance of things." Elior let a thin thread of light stretch upward, reaching toward the moon itself. The silver glow extended, twisting gently through the night sky, connecting the jar to its source in a luminous web. Stars shimmered faintly, bending slightly toward the pulse as though recognizing it. He realized that they were no longer merely holding the moonlight, they were participating in a delicate, cosmic dance, weaving themselves into the rhythm of the night itself. Below, the village remained asleep, but subtle changes were already noticeable. The river shimmered in fractured patterns, reflecting faint glimpses of impossible constellations. Shadows along the streets bent in ways that suggested consciousness, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate. Windows reflected the silver pulse, faintly illuminating sleeping faces, though no one would ever remember these moments consciously. Elior and the girl experimented cautiously, extending threads to individual rooftops. Each touch produced subtle consequences. A roof tile glimmered faintly, a shadow folded in unexpected ways, a small flock of birds adjusted its path mid-flight, aligning with the unseen rhythm of the moonlight. The pulse responded to their thoughts, their intentions, and even the smallest emotional fluctuations. A moment of fear produced a sharp quiver, a breath of wonder caused a warm ripple to flow across the village. Hours passed, though time seemed irrelevant. The moon hung heavy in the sky, luminous and patient, its pulse synchronized with the jar and the children holding it. Elior realized that the moonlight had begun to integrate itself into reality, subtly altering not only the village but the very perception of those who lived there. Dreams would carry fragments of its rhythm, shadows would respond to unseen movements, the river, the trees, even the air seemed to hum faintly with awareness. The girl reached for Elior's hand, and when their fingers touched, a surge of silver energy pulsed through them. The jar vibrated, a heartbeat that echoed across rooftops and streets, threading itself into the village like invisible filaments of light. For a moment, the village seemed suspended, caught in the delicate interplay between night, moon, and human consciousness. Elior's pulse quickened. "We're changing it," he whispered. Even without trying. The girl's eyes shone. "It's not just change, it's a conversation." Every ripple is like a sentence. And we're learning the language. They continued, experimenting with the silver thread. Lifting it higher caused the shadows of rooftops to coil gracefully, forming arcs that mimic the web of the night sky. Lowering it toward the ground caused flowers and grass to bend subtly toward the pulse, a quiet acknowledgement of presence. Even the river adjusted its flow slightly, reflecting patterns of light that were beautiful yet impossible, ephemeral yet tangible. Elior realized something profound. The moonlight was teaching through consequence. Every movement carried meaning. Every decision resonated outward, shaping reality itself. And the village, though unaware, was becoming a living canvas for their actions, responding to the pulse in ways both subtle and magnificent. But there was a warning in the pulse too. When Elior hesitated, uncertain of what to do next, the silver thread quivered sharply, reminding him of the power they were wielding. The moonlight did not punish, but it made itself felt, guiding them toward care, patience, and understanding. Every mistake, however small, would leave an echo. Every act of recklessness would ripple outward, subtle but undeniable. The night deepened, stretching infinitely around them. Elior and the girl sat in quiet awe, letting the silver thread pulse gently, observing the village as it subtly awakened to the presence of borrowed light. Each heartbeat synchronized with the jar, with the moon, with the pulse of the night itself. They realized that they were no longer merely observers, they were participants in the shaping of the world, weaving themselves into the fabric of existence. Hours, or perhaps days, seemed to pass in this suspended state. The river shimmered, the wind whispered, shadows danced, and the village, though unaware, was alive with faint traces of silver. The jar hummed softly, a living heartbeat in their hands, reminding them of the covenant they had entered, a promise of care, reverence, and patience. Elior lifted the silver thread toward the rooftops one final time, letting it pulse gently across the village. He felt the subtle acknowledgement of every tree, every street, every sleeping face. The moon above pulsed in perfect harmony, sending a faint ribbon of light that wrapped around both children, connecting them to the vast, luminous body that had been their secret companion for so long. The girl squeezed his hand. "We've done it," she whispered. "The village, it's changed. But not broken." Elior nodded, exhaustion and exhilaration washing over him. "And it will keep changing, as long as we're careful. As long as we remember it's alive." The moon hovered above, immense, luminous, patient. The village slept beneath the silver pulse, subtly transformed yet perfectly ordinary to those who remained unaware. And Elior understood, with deep, awe-filled certainty, that borrowing the moonlight was no longer a secret indulgence, it was a covenant with reality itself. A covenant of attention, care, and understanding. They sat together on the rooftop as the first hints of dawn brushed the sky, the jar pulsing faintly between them, a living fragment of eternity cradled in human hands. And as the stars faded and the village began its day, Elior realized that nothing would ever be ordinary. Again, the threads of silver had woven themselves into the village, into the night, into their hearts, and the lessons of the moonlight had only just begun.